All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Parent to Parent. Alongside me is Dr. Stan Spinner, and he's joining me today because there have been a lot of questions parents have had when it comes to going back to school, what's going on with COVID, monkeypox. That's also an issue, actually, a headline in the news. So, obviously, those concerns. I'm going to go ahead and bring you on, Dr. Spinner, and I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. First off, what are the main concerns that you are currently hearing at the hospital?
Well, we are seeing another very large increase in COVID transmission again throughout the community. And so, what we're seeing, certainly within the hospital and within our pediatric practices in TCP, as far as the primary care practices throughout the city, we're not only seeing children and families sick, but we're seeing our employees again getting COVID through community transmission, and then missing work at our offices or in the hospital. So we're kind of seeing what we did last year. What's different this year is that since so many people are either testing at home, and we're not getting reports of that, or they're just not testing because it's kind of not at the top of their mind anymore. We really are seeing, I think, a very small part of what's really going on. I know if you look at the wastewater information, it shows much higher, rates of COVID. So our concern is entering into the school year in just these next few weeks, kids going back to school. Very few people are being masked, so we don't anticipate many kids or teachers, for that matter, being masked at school. Everyone kind of getting back to their normal behaviors again. We really are concerned about what that's going to do to even further increase the transmission of COVID, in the early fall, especially.
I don't know what just happened. Okay, we're back. Can you hear me?
Yeah, did you not hear what I was saying?
No, I think the last part got cut off,
Oh,
but you were saying
okay.
there's more concern with the school year going in.
Right. I was talking about the different, the transmission and the large number of cases. Did you? I don't know
Yes.
where you lost me, so I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, we got that part too. And
Okay.
that's the concerning part because it kind of sometimes you forget there's COVID because you just see people out and about and not wearing masks and just, doing whatever. But what are some things you would caution parents going into this school year to make sure that they do for their child? We'll get into the vaccines in a little bit, but just
Sure.
specifically about their manners.
Yeah, well, the thing again is that there's that false sense of security, and unfortunately, that's going to put, I think, a lot more families at risk of getting sick. And the BA.5 variant, which accounts for over 80% of what we're seeing now in the U.S., is the most transmissible, or the most contagious variant yet. So it is so much more contagious than previous versions. So again, it's that much easier to get from much more casual type of exposure. So certainly going around without a mask is really, really a very big risk. And again, a lot of families who've been infected, because so many people have gotten it by now, with previous strains, again, they may feel, well, I'm not going to have to worry about it because I've already had COVID. But we see it time and time again. People get infected more than once and sometimes more than twice. There's some data that suggests it could be even worse the second time, or with subsequent infections. But certainly, previous infection does not protect you from subsequent infection. And again, that false sense of security, I'm afraid, is going to continue to put so many families and their kids in harm's way.
Yeah, definitely. So masking is definitely recommended still.
Absolutely.
When when it comes to the actual vaccine for children, the New York Times recently had a report out saying that 43% of parents of children's ages 6 months to 4 years say that they would refuse the shots for their children. And many in that age group, as you may know, have not been vaccinated. So with some of the concerns, I also wanted to bring that up because I was just kind of jotting down some of the main concerns they have: potential side effects, relative newness, lack of sufficient research. And I'm sure a lot of these concerns are something that you hear as well. So what's your response to them?
My response is that we know the vaccine is a very, very safe. We've been using the current vaccine, both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines in the United States, for some time now, hundreds of millions of doses given, and really over 1 billion doses given worldwide. We realize that there is a lot of concern for the younger kids. Parents are always going to be more concerned with their younger kids, and rightfully so. But we have tremendous safety data. We are wholly confident that these vaccines, both the Pfizer and the Moderna, are very, very safe. What parents hear, unfortunately, through social media or other forms of, some media, and certainly through friends, there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of disinformation. And I think it's easier sometimes to believe things that are bad versus things that are good, unfortunately. But we're seeing that in our practices. A lot of families that are reluctant to give their younger kids COVID vaccine when they've given their kids all the other routine vaccinations, they felt very safe. And, it is a little distressing to us as pediatricians that we can not only, relate to them that we've had the vaccines, our kids have had the vaccines, my grandkids have had the vaccines. We trust the safety, and we know that it is also very effective. And that's another, I think, area that's confusing, because we know that yes, we can be vaccinated and still get infected. Unfortunately, the vaccine isn't perfect, but we continue to see, even with all the variants, that these original vaccines continue to provide excellent protection against serious illness, against hospitalization, against death. I mean, it is extremely rare for people that are vaccinated, especially if they've had their primary series and the booster when it's recommended for them. Very, very rarely are those people going to get that sick. So it is a tremendously effective, both of these are tremendously effective vaccines. And again, a lot of disinformation about that.
And you bring up a good point, because I actually was talking to my girlfriends about it. I have a 2 and 5-year-old, and I was like, well, I just don't know. And they were like, well, all those shots you got for your kids when they were born, you just got the paper. You were like, okay, yeah, just give them. So it's kind of like the same thing. You just trust in the system. One of the common questions, I have a few of them from parents. This is one of them. Should parents wait if their child will move to an older vaccine dose group soon? Should they wait for that?
No, there's no advantage. What we have seen, again, the data is very clear on this, that the immune response that the younger kids get with that dose for that age is every bit as good as the higher dose would be when they move into that next age range. So there is no advantage. Now, if your child is, again, an example, so a child who is in that initial age range of 6 months to 4 years, and they're getting that first dose when they're 4, and let's say their birthday is in 2 or 3 weeks, by the time they get that second dose, they will have turned 5, and then they'll get the higher dose because it's based on the age. And we've had some families actually say, my child's turning 5 in 2 weeks. Can I just get the 5-year-old dose now? And actually you can. I mean, that's something you discuss, kind of one-on-one with your physician. And we've had that in the younger group. We've had that in the older group too, when that transition was within literally a few weeks, because some families opt for the higher dose. Others would rather their child stay with the lower dose if, again, let's say they just turned 5, and they say, hey, can I stick with my 4-year-old dose because my child just turned 5 2 weeks ago? The answer, again, you could do that as well. But typically you get the dose based on the age of your child's age at that time of the vaccine. That's what's typically recommended.
Okay. And then another one, why did officials authorize 2 doses for Moderna and 3 for Pfizer vaccines?
It's just the way that those vaccines were formulated. Moderna is a higher dose, and so they showed that they got adequate antibody titers from the 2 doses. I will also tell you that the 3-dose Pfizer regimen has been shown to provide a higher number of kind of protection. So it was like 80-something% for the 3-dose Pfizer in preventing infection compared to, I think, the 40s for Moderna. They're both good, but in that regard, and we do really expect that Moderna will probably come out with a recommendation for a 3rd dose at some point. But it's just the way that those are made. And so I wouldn't tell any parent you should do one over the other, because they're both going to provide, the type of protection that we're looking for against really preventing serious illness.
Okay. And the other one, are vaccines really necessary if it appeared the youngest children were largely spared from the effects of COVID-19 early on in the pandemic?
Well, yeah, the children were relatively spared early on in the pandemic, but that hasn't been the case subsequently. We have seen, over 14 million children who've been infected with COVID. We have seen thousands and thousands of these children who have been sick enough to be hospitalized. And about a third of every child who's put in the hospital, again, almost 1 out of every 3 kids hospitalized due to COVID are so sick they end up in the intensive care unit. So this is not sparing children like the original strain did. Yes, kids usually do better than adults, but very healthy kids. And again, when you look at the number of kids that have been hospitalized, the percentage, we think, well, the kids that are immunocompromised with underlying medical conditions are at higher risk. But even so, about a third of the kids who've been hospitalized overall with COVID have been completely healthy. So, you're playing Russian roulette if you want to let your child get infected, if you can prevent them from getting infected by, masking and being cautious. But you're also, playing even a bigger risk if you're saying, my child may get infected and they may end up being sick enough to be in the hospital. And there's nothing more tragic for a family than to watch your child laying in a hospital bed. It is so scary for the child and so scary for the parent.
I couldn't even imagine. So when, you feel like your child might have COVID, you give them the at-home test and that's negative. Do you think it's best to go and get the PCR test done for them as well?
That's one option. Certainly, we know the PCR is more accurate. So if you're talking about, symptoms early on, the first 1 or 2 days, and you get a negative, antigen test at home, you're more likely to get a more reliable result with a PCR. The other option would be is to assume you may have COVID, stay home, isolate, take those precautions, and then continue to home test again, for the next 2, 3, 4 days. Because if you have COVID, you're likely to show up positive, within the first, several days. At some point, if you continue to test negative, the odds are you probably didn't have it, you had something else. But if you were also other members of your family had tested positive for COVID, so there's a real high risk probability that you had it and you test negative, I would certainly recommend, confirming that, with a PCR, because we have seen many cases where someone's tested negative for several days for some reason with an antigen test. Again, really good likelihood of having COVID, again, family exposure and so forth. And indeed, they went and had a PCR and it was positive.
Yeah, the problem with the PCR, well, however you want to put it, is that it takes longer. So, hopefully the person is isolating during that time because, you're going about your business. It's like, I haven't gotten the results yet. And that's kind of what many people have seen too.
Yeah. And another part of this, again, it's so complicated. When there's a lot of COVID in the community, which is the case now, we're likely to see more false negatives with rapid tests. In other words, it may show negative, but you really are positive. When there's very little, so we've gone through periods of time when when it was really, really low, incidence,
Mm-hmm.
it was not as likely. So if you had a negative antigen test, you probably didn't have it because there wasn't much of it going around, but that's not the case now. So yeah, you really want to be sure. So if you're symptomatic and you have that negative antigen test on day 1, 2, or 3, I by itself would not assume that you don't have COVID based on just that.
And when it comes to, because I get this from, my son's school, and I'm sure parents as well, like, okay, so, a kid did test positive. Well, you have the choice of either sending your kid to school or, you don't, you send your kid to school. So in those cases where even I've talked with school district officials, they'll notify the parents whenever there is a COVID positive case. What should parents do to protect their child in that circumstance? Like, at what point do you say, okay, I'm going to have my child stay at home? That's the safest option.
Yeah, it depends on how much risk you're willing to assume for your child. But I don't even know honestly if the schools are that good about reporting anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I think it may depend on the school. But as a parent, if you hear that one child from your school or a couple of kids from your school have tested positive, I don't think that that's a reason to not send your child to school. But I would say it's certainly be sure that your child is wearing a mask, because that really will help protect him or her from that. Now, of course, the exposure may already have happened, and if that's the case, it's happened. You're not going to prevent it, but as long as your child is not sick at the time, that's okay. But again, when you're looking at, well, do I need to test my child? Because let's say it was in the classroom that your child is in, and that's a much more of a likely exposure than if it happened in another part of the school. Well, if your child has not been vaccinated, the CDC still recommends taking precautions and quarantining at home, which again means missing several days of school or missing several days of work for the parent. If you or your child has been vaccinated appropriately, then you don't need to quarantine. You could be at school or you could be at work wearing a mask. And again, if you're not having symptoms, you're fine. Recommendation is then to go ahead and get tested about day 5, and if you're negative, then you're good to go. So those are the different ways of dealing with it. But again, it's complicated. A lot of people have a hard time keeping track of that. Bottom line is, if you're not sure, go with what your instincts are. If you're worried, keep your child at home. If you have questions, talk to your pediatrician, and he or her can hopefully help you to make that decision what's best for you.
And the last thing I'm going to ask you is about monkeypox. What do parents need to know in terms of the rise in cases and when it pertains to their children?
I think the first thing that parents need to know, monkeypox is not COVID. It is completely different. The transmission is very less of a concern. We're hearing more and more about monkeypox. It's primarily spread, from skin to skin contact. People have open sores and lesions. It can be spread, through the air by large droplet, but basically you need to really be very close to another person, spending quite a bit of time face to face for that to happen. It's not spreading like COVID is spreading, so it's a lot less contagious. But having said that, kids, get together, they wrestle, or within a family, if an adult in the family has it and they're, touching one another, it doesn't have to be necessarily intimate touching. It could be just casual, handling, or even handling of things that have been touched by somebody who may have open lesions. That's how the virus is spread. Fortunately, we're not seeing a lot of it here, not yet. We hope that we won't. But again, I wouldn't tell people to be panicking about it. Just have at least some idea of kind of what it is, what it looks like. We've seen several suspected cases, but for the most part, they have not been monkeypox. There are a lot of other viruses that can cause very similar types of physical findings and similar symptoms. But just kind of be aware of it. But I wouldn't change what you're doing as far as your normal activity like we were doing with COVID, unfortunately.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Spinner, for your time. So big takeaways: still wear your mask, get vaccinated. And, we're not out of the woods yet. This BA.5 variant is nuts, to put it in layman terms.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Sure is. Well, thank you so much again. And thank all of you for joining us for this edition of Parent to Parent. Hope to see you next week. Please do make some comments if you have any suggestions and any questions. We can get those answered as well. So we hope you have a great week. And